Okay, let's move on now at this point to the other play of Sophocles that you read for this session, and that's Antigone. Please once again pause your video, and now in your Harris-Platzner textbook, turn to page 728, the beginning of Antigone. Please again pause your video and turn to Antigone, page 728. Okay, are you all set? Okay, so we just got done discussing Oedipus Tyrannus or Oedipus Rex in the video you just watched, and now we're going to pass to the other play, Antigone. Bear in mind that these three plays, Antigone, Oedipus Tyrannus, and Oedipus Colonus, do not form a formal trilogy as Oresteia does with Aeschylus, because these plays were not, in fact, produced in the same year and were actually produced out of the order that would be fitting for the storyline that's described in them. They do, however, form an informal Oedipus-related trilogy in the sense that the three plays do come together in the end to make a particular storyline. But remember that Oedipus Colonus was the intermediary play between Oedipus Tyrannus and Antigone, and it's very likely that Sophocles didn't necessarily have that in mind when he composed either of the other two plays. Okay, so the action of Oedipus Colonus, the missing play, is that once Oedipus is finally in exile, apparently the second time around, as I alluded to in the end of the last video, he wanders all over with his daughter Antigone and sometimes also his other daughter Ismene, and eventually ends up at Athens at Colonus, which is the grove right outside, which is also sacred to the Eumenides, the Furies, whom we saw at the final play of Aeschylus in his trilogy. So once Oedipus arrives there, initially the Athenians reject him because they know of his curse and also don't want him to tread on this sacred ground. But eventually it comes out who exactly he is and the fact that he's fated to actually arrive in Athens. And in the end, King Theseus ends up warmly welcoming Oedipus in his midst. However, that doesn't end things, because Thebes, it turns out, having exiled him, suddenly wants him back. And the reason is that Thebes receives an oracle that also ends up being known to the Athenians too, that whichever city is able to give proper burial to Oedipus will be blessed in the future. So, of course, Thebes wants this. Athens wants it too. So Polynices, the son, tries to persuade Oedipus to go back. He curses him and tells him to go away because it was Polynices who was responsible, together with Eteocles, who was responsible for exiling Oedipus in the first place. And Creon, who was relatively okay in Oedipus Tyrannus, now turns into a monster. He kidnaps Antigone and Ismene, trying to force Oedipus's hand. But Theseus, like the cavalry, comes to the rescue and manages to get the two girls away from Creon and dispatches Creon back to Thebes empty-handed. And so it's in this way that Theseus really becomes a big hero, and Athens, of course, is given a great deal of supremacy over Thebes in that particular play. In the end, Oedipus ends up dying at a secret location within Colonus. Even his two daughters, Antigone and Ismene, do not know. Only Theseus, in fact, does end up knowing Oedipus's exact whereabouts of his death. Thereafter, Antigone and Ismene have to go back to Thebes because the news comes of the combat between Eteocles and Polynices. This occurs because the two of them had an arrangement of a split of 6 months rule between them for each of them. But Eteocles ruled for the first 6 months, but then when it was Polynices' turn, Eteocles instead drove him out into exile and refused to give the throne to him. Reasons are not given for why that occurs. Polynices therefore flees to Argos and gets his uncle Adrastus to bring forward 6 other warriors together with himself to march against the city of Thebes, and that is depicted in Aeschylus' play that we didn't read, the one called 7 Against Thebes. In the battle that follows, Eteocles and Polynices kill each other in battle. Creon now has to become the regent of Thebes, and Creon declares that Eteocles, the current king, is given a state burial, but that Polynices, the traitor who attacked the city, is forced to stay outside the city, and his corpse will be unburied and will be pecked away by birds. And that is where Antigone comes into the picture, because Antigone of course, as we know, is related to Creon in a couple of different ways. But Antigone is also betrothed to Creon's son Haemon. And yet Antigone will not let go of her sisterly responsibility placed upon her by the gods to give proper burial to her brother, despite the decree. She tries to persuade Ismene to come on board as well. Ismene refuses, claiming that it's not a woman's place to stray into the purview of men, and certainly not to counter the will of the state. Consequently, Antigone is going to take it upon herself. Initially, the chorus, very interestingly, in that big chorus, the one that goes, "Wonders are numerous, but none more so than man," is quite skeptical about what Antigone is talking about. They say that the rule of law established by the state is in fact the most important advance in civilization that mankind has accomplished, and that civilization cannot work properly if one does not observe the rules and laws prescribed upon them by the state. The difficulty, however, is twofold here. Here we go. First of all, and this is explained to Creon later by Tiresias, the first problem is that although this is indeed the rule of the state, the need to actually bury a corpse, especially by a family member, is divinely sanctioned. And so Creon is effectively flouting divine law in trying to establish state law. Now, in reality, since Polynices formally was a traitor in attacking the city, there really wasn't much that Creon could do except deny Polynices state burial as a traitor, because obviously any kind of state action like that would essentially suggest that Polynices was right to make the invasion. It's curious that the original motive for the invasion, the blockade of Eteocles, is never actually discussed anywhere in this play. Polynices ends up coming off completely as the bad guy in this play. Okay, so that's the first difficulty, is that Creon formally is flouting divine law. But the second difficulty that arises is Creon's own personality, and this is what echoes Oedipus in the previous play. Creon is simply not going to be told that he can't do something personally. First, he's getting told off by his niece, who also is a woman, and second, he's getting told off by his son, who is youthful in comparison to him. And also, of course, both of them are his subjects, and subjects, of course, should not be telling off a king. So Creon, for personal reasons, also rejects what both Antigone and Haemon tried to advise him. Therefore, it's not until he gets word from Tiresias, which he also initially rejects, that in fact the burial of Antigone in the cave, together with the non-burial of Polynices, are both contrary to divine law. It's not until finally Creon is willing to accept this that at last he realizes that he does have to change his mind. The chorus persuades him, and at last he goes and gets Polynices buried, and then he tries to free Antigone. Here's, of course, where the tragedy arises. It's too late. Antigone was not, of course, going to wait for her own death inside this cave enclosure where she was sentenced. Instead, she takes, ironically, her bridal veil and hangs herself with it. And when Creon and Haemon discover the hanged body, Haemon rushes forward and embraces it, and then turns his sword on his father, but misses, and then turns the sword, and by the way, deliberately, not by accident, as sometimes it's misinterpreted, turns the sword deliberately on himself to commit suicide. When word gets back about this to Thebes, and in advance of Creon's own return to Thebes, his wife Eurydice hears about this, and she immediately turns back into the palace and commits suicide herself. So Creon ends up, ironically, as the tragic hero here, in the sense that he tried very hard to observe the rules of the state and set those rules properly, but in doing so failed to understand other outside ramifications, and then tragically allowed his own personality flaw to get in the way of what would actually should in fact have been recognizable to him. So an interesting point, therefore, is in fact to what extent Creon is tragic hero versus whether Antigone is the tragic hero. because Antigone, of course, formally is the tragic hero in the sense that she is, of course, the one after whom the play is named, and it is she who gives up her life for the cause of getting her brother buried. But you might notice that the rather uncomfortable point about Antigone, that initially she goes out and provides a token burial for her brother by sprinkling dust over him. And that would in fact have been enough to carry out the burial. However, when the guard takes all the sand off and makes the body unburied again, Antigone goes back again to do it again. And you get a sense when she does it the second time that something else is going on with her besides just the duty to carry out the burial, that she's becoming herself quite stubborn and intractable, and maybe is obsessed with the idea of becoming a martyr if necessary for this cause. So she herself is given to obsession and has some of the same personality flaws, as it turns out, as Creon does. Creon himself is obviously a personally very weak person. But once again, the real tragedy of his position is that he is actually carrying out a state decree that is in fact appropriate for the time. Polynices did attack the city. The reason for it is really not to be considered here that with that much weight. He did attack the city. That does make him a traitor. The rejection of his burial is in fact an appropriate state action to take, because it would have been a state funeral necessary to bury somebody in the royal family. The unfortunate predicament Creon is in is that it means that he has to ignore his own family responsibility as well as the responsibility to the gods. He really was just in a predicament with no good answer. And unfortunately, his personality flaw of trying to be all righteous in every effect and not listen to anybody means that he ends up refusing to listen to the advice that would tell him that he needs to be more flexible, and by the time he learns it, of course the lesson is too late, and he loses everybody in his life after that. So it's really a remarkable tragedy, really effectively with two tragic heroes. And it appears that Sophocles' point is to understand the tragedy that both of them get stuck in. And once again, as with Oedipus, notice that free will pushes the action forward. Antigone is motivated by her own free will to carry out the burial. After the guard seizes her and takes her in to see Creon, then it's Creon's own free will to refuse to listen to Antigone, later to refuse to listen to Haemon, and finally to refuse initially to listen to Tiresias, and only finally to listen to the citizenry of the chorus to finally get the message, but too late. Last interesting political point here is that obviously Thebes is being contrasted as a monarchy with Athens, a democracy. And Antigone was written probably in the 440s BC, prior to the war, and Oedipus Tyrannus might possibly have been written in 427 BC to go along with the plague that struck Athens. It's possible that the plague that strikes Thebes is meant to be an allegory of that particular plague, but unfortunately we can't really be sure. But what is reasonably clear is that the failings of monarchy in Thebes are clearly meant to be contrasted with the success of democracy in Athens. And in Oedipus of Colonus, you must remember that Theseus, who is in fact a king, was the most democratic of kings because he conferred, according to the Athenian history, of course, he conferred democratic-like powers onto the populace. So consequently, Thebes is being held up here as the role model for how monarchy doesn't work. And in fact, when Haemon tries to advise Creon, watch it, the will of the people is turning against you. They're muttering in discontent that they don't like what they're seeing with you. Creon not only rejects Haemon because of the personal issues between them, but also refuses even to consider the will of the people because, well, after all, they're his subjects. They just have to do whatever he says and just go right along. So the idea of insisting on obedience and not recognizing the need for a somewhat more democratic approach that might have led to a more positive outcome means that monarchy ends up essentially trapped in its own petard, so to speak. And Creon is unable, therefore, to resolve his problem suitably. Okay, well, I hope that you enjoyed those plays. Make sure you get your character presentation done onto the forum, and also respond to one other student's character presentation. And we'll be soon moving along in later videos to Eurypylus' Medea, the final tragedy that you'll be reading in this course, from ancient Athens before we turn afterwards to Roman literature. Okay, we'll see you next video.